Thank you for attending the defense of my dissertation. I'm going to spend a few moments explaining what it is that I researched before the defense begins. The research question, what is psychodynamic executive group coaching and why does it work, with whom and in what conditions, is essentially to form a theory which does not exist in social science literature currently. I'd like to give you a picture for those of you that are not familiar with this as an intervention, what might be happening here if you haven't read the research yet. Imagine that a group of executives, 28 executives, are taken to a business school. They're divided into groups of 4. They're assigned an executive coach, and they're offered the opportunity to spend a day together with that executive coach, with some feedback, with 360-degree feedback taken from their professional context, but also feedback taken from their personal realm. And this is where the psychodynamic element comes in. And they spend a day working through that feedback, the ambition being that at the end of the day they will formulate something that will help them to develop as individuals and to become maybe more psychologically healthy in both the professional and the personal realm, that their leadership will become more effective. A number of things happened during the course of that day. We asked them to do strange things in the executive forum, like drawing a self-portrait, and actually sometimes we turn the chair around and have them look out of the window while people discuss them. It's a strange environment, and it's known as a transitional environment in the social sciences. It, on the one hand, takes them off balance, and on the other hand, it allows them to experiment a little bit with different aspects of themselves. The origins of this intervention were from the 1940s. The work of Kurt Lewin took executives out of their normal environment, places like Kodak, Xerox, General Electric, the household names that you'll be familiar with, and put them in what he called encounter groups. But these were not very well formulated. People sat together and essentially chatted. And by the 1980s, encounter groups, according to the social science literature, had fallen away and were debunked. Nevertheless, in the early 1990s, executive coaching was starting to take hold. At INSEAD, the Global Leadership Center was formed. Professor Engelor and Professor Ketz de Vries took a group of executives from the advanced management program and started to put them in groups and have them work through feedback with each other. And what happened actually was that they danced between the groups to try to facilitate them, realizing that they would get so much more from the experience if they assigned them a coach. This is precisely what they did, and this is how this intervention first started. So around 2000, 2001, this became much more formulaic. So why research it? A number of reasons. First of all, executive coaching has been proliferating over the last 15 to 20 years. But it's been proliferating in an unregulated way. It's rather fragmented still as a profession. When we looked at the data, and we've started to collect data in 2003 around this intervention, we could clearly see that it worked. And if something works, it's therefore important to understand why it works. Group coaching is poorly understood. In fact, group coaching is barely transacted anywhere. So this was a very good area for research, and moreover, there were some clear researchable components: the psychodynamic element, the group element, and the coaching element. What I felt by embarking on this was that if we could really understand it, it might be reproducible and generalizable across different populations beyond even executives. So what did I look at? Well, in order to produce something reasonable and a decent theory, I wanted to narrow down the search to something that I felt was understandable. So I looked at the International Executive Program. The International Executive Program is generally a cohort of around 60 people. Over 7 or 8 years, the results of the IEP were phenomenal. And I took one cohort and I studied that cohort 14 months after the end of the program itself. I ran a qualitative study. There was an opportunity, of course, to do a quantitative study, but frankly, because it wasn't properly understood, a qualitative study made more sense. I wanted to really dig into what had happened and why it had happened and what it meant to them. I observed the process end to end. and annotated it in granular form. I ran an extensive literature review, not only of the meta-analysis of randomized control trials of the different elements of this, namely the psychodynamic therapeutic element, group process, and coaching, but also I ran a theoretical literature review as well, and that's reflected in the research. I discovered a number of interesting things, some actually quite unexpected, some very expected. As you would expect, psychodynamic approaches help people. When you self-reflect, when you begin to understand yourself better, you move forward broadly. This is not only true in psychotherapy, this is also true in group therapy, and seemingly from the literature also in coaching. When these three things are synthesized, which is essentially what happens in this intervention, they form a separate and discrete intervention of their own. The group element being the key variable. If you get a fantastic group, if you get an interesting group, a group that really engages, the participant will get so much more from the experience. Characteristics of talking cures, namely psychotherapy, group therapy, and all the other talking cures, counseling, mentoring, show up in this intervention, and they show up quite clearly. And when I talked to the practitioners, it became evident that there were some clear synergies between what they did in different types of talking intervention and what we were doing here. Things like the therapeutic alliance showed up as what we might now term the coaching alliance. Transitional phenomena showed up. Putting people into these rather strange spaces and have them reflect on themselves were clearly present in the literature and also were happening here. What I found that I discovered that was actually surprising is that beyond the life of the program and beyond the life of the intervention itself, these groups stayed intact. I studied the group, as I said, 14 months after the end of the program. They were still in touch with each other. They were not only still in touch with each other, they were supporting each other and engaging with each other on different subjects than the ones that they had engaged with each other at the time of the intervention itself. So clearly there is a human element to this which is powerful and useful. And there are other possible secondary gains which we may discuss during the course of this defense. But I did draw some conclusions. As you'd expect from a piece of research, you'd want to see something hard and concrete coming out of it. Well, I think what the number one thing that I discovered is that from these three different separate interventions, there is a dynamic interaction that creates a fourth discrete, reproducible, and I would propose generalizable process, which I would also propose is measurable going forward, although I didn't get to that level of data in this study. And I think from this you can hypothesize a theory as a theory stands in the social sciences. What I also discovered is that there are sustainable and predictable results. That when you look at this intervention, not only in the International Executive Program, but across other programs, across the business school, and in other geographies, there are good results, predictable results, if you create the right conditions. If there is containment and an adequate deployment of the intervention, it works and it will continue to work. The therapeutic alliance, and here I've put this in inverted commas, which becomes, if you like, the coaching alliance, is important. If trust is not built quickly, then this will not work, and that's a key and critical element to this. And then my final conclusion, which is to some extent my own conjecture, but talking with people, one can substantiate it, is that executives create meaning from going through a process like that. Meaning is a strange word, it's an often used word nowadays, but when I say that, it means they take more than just what's delivered from the intervention. It actually helps them in their lives, and they remember it, which I think is fascinating and also interesting. I'd like, if I have time, just to mention... I do not have time. Okay. So to conclude, there are a number of areas which we can research in the future. You'd expect this threw up more questions than answers. Some of these you can see on the slide here, and I think I would recommend that many of my learned colleagues would actually continue to research this, as will I. Thank you.